A priest can refuse to conduct a funeral of someone who's committed suicide in cases of assisted dying. My name is Burgess, and I have an unusual dual role, which is I am religious affairs correspondent and also science reporter at the Times.
And in a way, the subject of assisted dying fits quite perfectly into both of those. You are the man to talk to on this.
Well, it's indeed. I mean, I also did a little bit of cover for our health correspondent a few years ago, so I have written about the subject from the point of view of what are doctors and physicians saying about it, but probably more so from what are archbishops and imams and rabbis saying about the matter and how they try to express that in a way that the public makes sense of, even if perhaps they're not religious themselves.
Well, Kai, in a way, the fact that this is now being discussed very seriously in Parliament as a bill that might be adopted, might become a law, feels like a huge cultural shift in this country.
Well, the whole attitude to suicide is kind of fascinating. It's sort of scarcely believable that it used to be a criminal offence to commit suicide, which obviously seems slightly bizarre, but of course it meant that people who attempted suicide and had a failed suicide attempt could be prosecuted, which obviously heaps another horror on top of whatever mental health issue they were going through beforehand. Amazingly, up to the beginning of the 19th century, it was considered usual to bury someone who'd committed suicide at a crossroad with a stake through the body. They weren't allowed to be buried in churchyards until about the 1820s, when they were allowed to be buried in churchyards, but only between 9 p.m. and midnight, and with no burial rites according to the Church of England, which is kind of mad to think of. 1880s, it was changed again to say, okay, they can be buried at any time of the day with some rites of the church. It was actually only in 2017, so when I'd started doing the religious affairs job at the Times, that the General Synod formally changed its laws to say we're going to remove those kind of bars entirely, mainly because priests had been doing that anyway. But it still retains this idea in there that a priest can refuse to conduct a funeral of someone who's committed suicide in cases of assisted dying, if that's part of what their conscience believes. So it still remains this kind of stigma associated with it.
So in terms of religion, suicide, assisted dying, definitely frowned upon. Even the law, though, in this country has changed, as you say.
Well, I mean, so much of the law in this country clearly was informed by Christian theology for a long time. And if you go back to theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas, he was one of the ones who said it's a mortal sin to commit suicide because life is a gift from God, and therefore you are kind of violating that. That was a kind of a major thing. But it was illegal in civil law until 1961, amazingly. And I looked back, and there's a Times leader on the subject from 1956, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, but which found that 613 people in 1956 were prosecuted, and 33 people were sent to prison in the 50s for having attempted suicide. So it was up to that point still considered a crime. In the church's own kind of laws, the phraseology is, it denied funerals to those who, being of sound mind, have laid violent hands upon themselves. And so it really was this kind of, this taboo that people were being prosecuted after having suffered already.
And you mentioned how the church has sort of changed its mind on that. It's now, it's much easier to have a funeral for somebody who killed themselves than it would have been in the past.
Yes.
And the law. What about the medical profession? I mean, not so much on suicide, but certainly on the idea of assisted dying. How much have things changed there?
See, that's a really interesting one. I mean, people sometimes discuss the Hippocratic Oath, and they talk about this idea that it has a phrase in it saying, do no harm. There's a little bit of mythology around that, in that doctors don't all swear some agreed text which states this. That doesn't really, no doctors actually have to swear any kind of oath in the UK.
Really? I always assumed there was sort of, it's a bit like when you're in a court trial or something, there's a little passage you have to read.
So no, it's not quite true. Most medical schools and universities, they do in the graduation ceremony have some sort of wording which sort of one would recognise as being along those sorts of lines of the Hippocratic Oath. Some of them have different phrases in them that talk about, I will do my best to alleviate pain and suffering, which I suppose some people might say, well, you could read into that perhaps it being okay for assisted dying in that sense. But usually they do contain something about I will not cause harm to patients. The idea in the public consciousness that doctors have this overriding goal to preserve life as much as possible is what has always, in most of the big medical associations, British Medical Association, BMA, Royal College of Physicians, they generally had an opposition to assisted dying. What's changed in the last few years is I don't think any have come out to support it, but they've passed these resolutions changing their position from one of formal opposition to one of neutrality, which is quite interesting, which has increased the space for debate on the subject. Now that those doctors are essentially, by doing that, saying, look, we're open to discussion. They haven't kind of come out and backed it, but it's been quite fine margins in the votes.
And in terms of society, how much has changed? How has the idea of assisted dying changed culturally?
Different opinion polls ask slightly different questions in their wording in terms of, do you in principle support assisted dying, or would you personally consider it? And so it's hard to track it over a long period of time. Interestingly, the proportions who say they support it vary anywhere from 65 to about 83%, but it's almost always, all the polls I've seen in the last 10 years say there's public support for it. The opposition is quite constant at about 13%, and the don't knows tend to be, the varying ones. So there's public support for it, it would seem. When you drill down in those surveys into the nitty-gritty of what safeguards should there be, that can lead things to kind of fluctuate slightly. But the interesting thing is that, I've made a note here of the various occasions when this has gone to Parliament, and MPs are very much against it. 1997, it was defeated by 234 votes to 89 in the Commons. 2005, it was defeated. It was defeated in Scotland in 2010. It was defeated in Parliament in Westminster in 2015 again. So it's interesting to see that public opinion has been pro it, but MPs less so.
That's The Story from The Times and The Sunday Times. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.